Valuation. Valuation is really a very crucial point to discuss with a venture capitalist. However, don't overestimate valuation. And especially because nobody really knows whether you can calculate a value or whether it's just an art to define a value or whether it's just a discussion. If you look into what happens outside these doors, you can see many stories about companies that were valued. And this example, WhatsApp, is for sure one of those companies we were really surprised about the valuation when it was sold at the very end. If you look at the story, how it was valued before, they started in 2009 with a 250K seed round, and especially the final round in 2013, which was not long ago before the company was sold, was on a 1.5 billion valuation, and it was a 50 million round. So what about this 1.5 billion valuation? Was that a true valuation? What is, by the way, a true valuation? At the very end, WhatsApp was sold for, I said that before, 19 billion. Is that valuation to be justified? Well, nobody really can rationally do that. So many people say valuation, it's always between art and science. If we at the business schools say, okay, let's look at the science part first, we can come up with some ways to value a company. But if you, honestly, if you look into your company lifetime, you probably a lot more start with an art of evaluating your company. Why is that? Because in early stages of a company, when there is nothing but a business plan and maybe a team, how do you really justify a million valuation? I mean, that might be too early for VC's natural entry point. So later on, there's a little track record. But even with a little track record and with losses which are just added up and more losses to come, how do you justify a positive valuation in some discounted cash flow models? And what other factors do play a role in valuing your company, like the entrepreneurial team? We always say in entrepreneurship, the team is the most important, so it must play a role. What is with other funding sources? So the competition you can basically build up between various VCs or between a VC and angels. And what about your numbers? How do you believe in the numbers? Are they really the numbers you think you can count on? Or you think they're overestimated? What's the VC's perspective on that? And also the current economic climate. We've seen the new economy bubble and we've seen the financial crisis, and we were able to see that valuations were very much different in those stages. So this is why people say it's between an art and in science. And as a starting point, you can always go in with some really easy methods, especially angels use in order to value a company. And one is the so-called Burkus method. It is a method David Burkus, or Dave Burkus, a super angel, started to use. And he just said, well, you can add up millions. So take a sound idea and it counts for 1 million, take a prototype, it counts a little more, take a good management team, counts for 1 or 2 million, board quality, sales, and so on. So that's really a rule of thumb, but it's a very easy way to go into evaluation, especially with an angel. It's simple, it reflects some, reasonable arguments why a startup can be successful, but it is really unclear because it leads to discussions. Is it really true for biotech in the same way as internet and so on? So you see, it's an easy way to step into that. The other easy way, or one other easy way, is the so-called rule of thirds. Angels sometimes say that 1/3 of the investment goes to the founders, 1/3 to the capital provider, and 1/3 to the management. If I say angels say that, This is because it's very true for early stages to use those models. And even if you step into venture capital in very early stages, you might want to use those models. If your company is more elaborated, if you do have numbers, if you have good projections, you might go a step further and go towards valuation being a science. Two of the mostly used scientific models are the DCF model on the one hand and the multiple model on the other hand. And those are especially used when you do valuations of large corporations in merger situations and so on. But you can also try to apply them to your situation. So what is a discounted cash flow model? Well, what you basically do is you take the cash flows of the future and you discount them to today's date and try to find out how much $1 million in 3 years count for today. And this is how you basically build up a valuation. So you take cash flows over the future, you calculate them and discount them. It is a complex method and you need detailed information, especially of forecasts, but if you're able to do that, the number might be quite well. The other way to do that is the multiple model. So how do you do that? You basically look for a comparable company and you try to compare your own company to that comparable company. And not necessarily by comparing like revenues or those hard numbers. You can also compare users if you're an internet startup in the earlier days. And you say, okay, this company being traded officially or just being sold recently has this number of users, and your company has this number of users, and this company had that valuation, and your company has to have an equivalent valuation, which you can calculate by using the multiple of this comparable factor users, for example. So you take a relative market value measure that you calculate for comparable companies, maybe one company, maybe more company, and you try to find those multiples in order to compare your company. It is a very simple method, but it also could be complicated because you do not really find comparable companies, or it's not too easy to find your comparable companies. And it's especially difficult if you want to compare your small company to a highly elaborated, established company. I mean, if you start the same thing as Amazon does today, you find lots of comparables. However, will you ever be able to build a company like Amazon? Probably not. So finding the comparables is the most difficult thing. However, you can also try to approach that, especially with startup companies that have recently been sold. Now, if you compare those two scientific models, or if you look at them a little closer, as I said before, the discounted cash flow models is a theoretically very good established model. If you're able to build the numbers, if you're able to calculate the numbers, you can also calculate your value. It's a dynamic approach, and it especially allows you to build scenarios and thus gives you a good understanding of the value drivers of your own company. So if you have different scenarios, you can better understand how your company relies on the ingoing numbers into your model. The downside always is, what do you want to discount in the future if you have negative cash? You probably end up with a negative value, which you don't want. So you go in periods which are more far away, and then those calculations, those future estimations are really, really only rough. So you can't really rely on that. So mostly then the whole discounted cash flow comes out of some kind of terminal value, and then this model doesn't really represent what's happening in the future. This can be really complex in the DCF model, and this is why you can really calculate DCF models for large and established companies if it comes to uncertain situations where your company is for sure in. If you look for venture capital, it's very difficult to determine a discounted cash flow properly. Talking about the multiples, it's easy to communicate. If you can find comparable companies, as I said, if it lacks comparable companies, it's probably also difficult to do that. So bottom line, basically, there's no best scientific way to find a company's value. You see, this is still between arts and science. Your company, if you do the valuation, is in the middle between art and science. It is not in the business angel stage where you really have to guess the numbers, but it's also not in the elaborated stages where you really know about the numbers more certain than in your situation. You're dealing with uncertainty, so you might want to try to use a discounted cash flow model. You might want to try to use the multiple model. However, be aware that in most cases, it's about the discussion. It's about building trust to a potential VC. It's about your relationship. And this is also our last slide in here, because you can go into more details with valuation. We can just only cover a little bit. So how do you get a fair deal with the VC? Well, the first thing, you have to get to know the VC, and maybe long before you start getting capital from these guys. So you build a relationship which is based on trust. You showed him some numbers before. He can see that the numbers you showed him before and the projections might be true, so he gains trust into your company. And secondly, both parties get a good understanding that they will be adequately rewarded for future success. So if the VC gives you some money, he gets a return, and some VCs only say, okay, it's 5 times the money. And for you to understand that is important, but you also have to think about what happens in 3 or 5 years when my company is being sold. I mean, you probably won't make a WhatsApp deal, but you might want to make a good deal of a couple million, of a couple $100 million valuation when the company is sold. So who's rewarded in which way in that case? So also getting an understanding for that and also discussing that with the DVC might help to determine a better valuation, a better path towards building value in the company. And then very, very important also for you as an entrepreneur. For sure, we talk about valuation and it's about valuation. However, it's about, at the very end, it's about optimizing value and not just valuation. So it's about building a business. How much money do you need to build that business, to build proper value? And secondly, it's not only valuation that counts, because also other contractual details are very, very important in the whole deal. So it's a more complex scenario, and we are going to talk about that in the term sheets. And last but not least, do not only focus on the money. Some companies want specific VCs in their company because they know, for example, that venture-backed companies have higher IPO value. Studies say that. And if you have certain VCs, good quality VCs on board, VCs that might be able to help you adding value, it's much better than getting a better valuation from a VC nobody knows. So you see, the chapter valuation is a really, really difficult and complex thing. We just wanted to give you an idea of how to deal with that. And now we're going over to also talk about term sheets and try to get a better idea how to build value in the whole relationship.